The Haunting of Fox Hollow Farm. Robert and Vicki Graves thought they were purchasing their dream home when they discovered Fox Hollow Farm in Indianapolis, Indiana. But soon they would realize they were not alone in the house. Are the spirits of Herb Baumeister's victims haunting the property where they were brutally murdered? Or perhaps it's Herb himself who's behind the paranormal experiences that people have had there. The Graves family went into Fox Hollow Farm in Indiana with no clue what was waiting for them. They were soon recounted on the horror that happened on the farm. Serial killer Herb Baumeister lived there and killed at least 25 young men before committing suicide in Canada after escaping U.S. law in the 1990s. He buried most of their bodies all around the farm. Law enforcement removed more than 5,000 bone fragments, but the Graves found more. They reported seeing ghosts and hearing strange knocks, but it was Joe LeBlanc, a man who rented an apartment on the property, who had the most specific encounter. He claims to have made contact with the ghost of Herb Baumeister, even recording the session. A voice could be heard repeating the phrase, "the married one." LeBlanc had been asking who was walking in the kitchen. As all of Baumeister's victims had been single, he determined this answer must mean the spirit was Baumeister himself. Herb Baumeister was once again the subject of a television show. County serial killer was featured on Paranormal Witness on Sci-Fi. The episode is Fox Hollow Farm after Baumeister's property. Baumeister was the Westfield businessman who authorities believe stalked Indianapolis gay bars in the mid-1990s and picked up unsuspecting men and drove them to his property where he allegedly killed and buried them. He was considered a suspect by police, but fled to Canada as investigators began digging up the backyard. The remains of several young men were found in the grounds. The early life of Herb Baumeister. Herb was the oldest of 4 children, with his childhood being reportedly normal. By the onset of adolescence, however, he began exhibiting antisocial behavior. Acquaintances later recalled the young Baumeister playing with dead animals and urinating on a teacher's desk. As a teenager, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but he didn't receive any further psychiatric treatment. As an adult, he drifted through a series of jobs marked by a strong work ethic, but also by more and increasingly bizarre behavior. Herb was able to get away with a lot of his odd behavior, with his dad being a doctor and pulling strings for his son. Despite being odd and not very good with the opposite sex, Herb married in 1971 to a woman named Julie Sater, a union that produced 3 children. Now let's get into the investigation. In the early 1990s, investigators with the Marion County Sheriff's Department and the Indianapolis Police Department began investigating the disappearance of gay men in the Indianapolis area. In 1993, investigators were contacted by a man claiming that a gay bar patron, calling himself Brian Smart, had killed a friend of his and he had attempted to kill him. The detectives told him to contact them in the case that he ever saw the man again. In November of 1995, he called them and supplied the man's license plate after checking the license registry. Investigators discovered that Brian Smart was actually Herb Baumeister. Investigators then approached Baumeister at one of his stores and told him he was a suspect in the disappearances and asked to search his house. When Baumeister refused, investigators confronted his wife Julie, who also forbade the police to search the house. But by June 1996, Julie Baumeister had become sufficiently frightened by her husband's mood swings and erotic behavior that after filing for divorce, she consented a search. And that was when she mentioned that her son had found a skull on the property. But at the time, it was explained away, but now it clicked. Frightened and shocked, she was ready for them to investigate. The search of the 18-acre estate named Fox Hollow Farm was conducted while Baumeister was on vacation, turning up the remains of at least 11 young men, only 5 of whom were ever identified. Baumeister, who got wind of this search, escaped to Ontario, where he committed suicide at Pinery Provincial Park by shooting himself in the head. In his suicide note, he described his failing marriage and business as his reason for killing himself. He never confessed to the murders of the men found in his backyard. In addition to the murders at his estate, Baumeister is also suspected of killing 9 more men, the bodies of whom were found in rural areas along the corridor of Interstate 70 between Columbus, Ohio, and Indianapolis, Indiana. Julie Baumeister told authorities that her and the children would often visit her mother-in-law for weeks at a time, and that's how she never knew anything. The Hauntings at Fox Hollow Farm. Years passed while the estate and mansion stood empty. It was finally on the market, and the incredibly cheap property was sold to Rob and Vicki Graves. The mansion had been gutted after it was vacated, and everything in it was new. The Graves thought everything bad was gone from the mansion. Everything seemed great in their new home, except one day when Vicki experienced an unexplained occurrence. She had attempted to vacuum up gravel from around the lush indoor pool. The gravel had been tracked in by her kids. The vacuum kept coming unplugged at the extension cord without any explainable reason for the unpluggings. Vicki was a bit confused when it happened 3 times. She sensed that she was not alone and that they, or whatever it was, didn't want her there, but she shrugged it off. Rob worked at a car dealership, and his colleague Joe LeBlanc had been facing a terrible daily commute to work, which left him oftentimes late for work. Joe needed to move closer to the dealership, and naturally Rob offered to let Joe move into the spare apartment on the estate, which they had been meaning to rent out anyway. Joe, unfazed by the history of the house, brought his belongings and his dog Fred and moved into the apartment. Joe fell asleep once he and Rob were finished moving him in because the move was so exhausting. While sleeping, he dreamed that he was running for his life, and he felt that something bad was chasing him. He awakened in a state of panic and tried to run. He hit the door frame so hard that he collapsed onto the floor. He was in terrible pain. Shards of glass were everywhere, and they had gotten into his hands. He was unsure of what he was running from, but he felt the sense he had to get out of there as fast as he could. In another occurrence, something caught Vicki's eye one day when she came home from work to find Rob painting. He had accomplished a surprising amount of work on his task, and she was looking over his work when she noticed it. A man in a red t-shirt was standing in their yard. As he turned and walked away, she realized that she couldn't see his legs. Suddenly, all of him disappeared. She and Rob walked over to the area where the man had been, only to find nothing there. Rob installed security cameras on the premises in hopes of catching him on them if the stranger came back. One night, while Joe was washing dishes in his apartment, he heard a knock on his door. The knocking became insistent, and when Joe finally opened the door, there was nothing there. He looked around and finally went back in and locked the door. He couldn't shake off the feeling of discomfort, and he felt he was being watched. Fred, Joe's dog, started behaving like he saw something, but Joe saw nothing. On another night, Joe was out walking Fred when he heard something in the woods. Fred had stopped walking, and his ears were standing straight up like he was listening to something. As they were heading back toward their apartment, Joe saw a man in a red t-shirt. The stranger turned and headed toward the woods and disappeared. Fred gave a good chase after him anyhow. And of course Joe chased after his dog because he had no way of knowing the intentions of the stranger. While running in the woods to find Fred, Joe came face to face with the stranger. Terrified, Joe turned and ran for his life, and Fred was chasing close behind. Upon Joe telling Rob and Vicky about the incident, they had realized that they had seen the same man. One night, Joe was awakened by someone once again knocking on his door. He called out to see who it was, but received no answer. He felt the panels in his door, and they were vibrating from the knocking. Joe opened the still vibrating door, only to see that no one was there. He noticed the door knocker was raised as if some unseen hand was ready to knock again. When it came down and completed its knock, Joe quickly closed the door. He bolted it shut, feeling just a bit safer. He went back into his room to find a growling Fred, and then he heard the sound of the front door knob turning. The doorknob twisted and vibrated violently from whoever was trying to get in. The sound stopped. Seconds later, the door burst open, and wood chips went flying across the apartment. Unnerved but baffled, he stepped out of the apartment, and when he turned to come back inside, he saw a man inside the apartment. The man seemed to be screaming and running for his life. He was trying to get away from someone or something. Joe now suspected that his intruder had been one of Baumeister's unfortunate victims. Joe, along with Rob and Vicky Graves, researched what was known about the events on the property. They were viewing some old news footage, including pictures of some of Baumeister's victims, when Joe spotted a picture of the ghost, which seemed to be running for his life in the apartment. Rob was starting to worry that Joe might be becoming obsessed with the Baumeister case. One day, Joe was walking through the woods with Fred. Fred took off running and Joe chased after him. When Fred stopped, something caught Joe's eye. He had dug it out of the leaves, and it was a human bone. He took it straight to Rob and Vicky, and Vicky knew instantly that it was human. It seemed to be a femur. He had found it near the same area where they had seen the man in the red shirt. Rob reported the finding to the lead detective on the case, who agreed to come out and show them where the events had happened. It was believed that Baumeister had strangled his victims near or even in the woods. One of Joe's friends, named Jeremy, wanted to come to the house. Jeremy wanted to see on his own accord the hauntings of this house. They were all in the pool and dive in to retrieve dead beetles which had sank to the bottom of the pool. Joe felt someone touch his back, first thinking that maybe it was one of the guys. He soon realized that they were on the other side of the pool, so it couldn't have been them. Joe was suddenly pulled under the water as he tried to swim back towards his friends. Invisible, cold fingers gripped his neck and were choking him. Jeremy saw Joe grabbing his neck and had a very panicked look on his face that Jeremy had never seen before. Joe managed to escape and he hurried out of the pool. He was in a state of terror and demanded that his friends get out of the pool immediately. He feared it would get them all, and perhaps even succeed in killing him. Finally, one night Joe was working at his computer. He heard a metallic scraping noise, so he investigated. He found a knife laying on the counter, and there were cuts in the wood walls. It made him question if maybe someone had been stabbed in the kitchen. After watching a couple ghost hunter shows, he unplugged everything that he possibly could that might make any noises. He then used his cell phone as a recorder, and he decided to do an EVP session and see what maybe he could catch. He asked if anyone was there, and within moments, Fred started barking. Joe then took his cell phone to his computer to listen and see if he had caught anything. There was a clear response to his question. The voice said, "The married one." All of Baumeister's victims had been single gay men. The only one there who had been married was the murderer himself. Herbert Baumeister had to be back from his grave, and to this day, Joe is convinced that he is still around the Fox Hollow farm. It's apparent that evil never dies, it just simply changes form and continues to be a form of evil. Current residents and visitors to the property have reported unsettling feelings and unexplainable noises, and even seen apparitions inside the house and around the grounds. A paranormal investigation team, including psychics, demonologists, EVP, and visual specialists, investigated the 18-acre estate over a 6-month period. So, do you dare set foot inside a suspected serial killer's house of horrors? Herb Baumeister is suspected of murdering up to 25 young men and burying many of their remains across his 18-acre Indiana estate, known as Fox Hollow Farm. So go and do your own research to see the accounts of Fox Hollow's current owner, Robert Graves' in-depth account of the case of Herb Baumeister and the paranormal activity that hangs over the suspected serial killer's former home. A gripping blend of true crime reporting and first-hand paranormal encounters awaits you. I didn't really go into the true crime side of the Fox Hollow Farm. I mainly went into the hauntings, and I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and thank you all for watching this episode of Tales Told in the Dark.